Welcome to Focused on Christ, where we are passionate about exalting Christ and equipping the church. I'm your host, Mike Crump, here with Pastor Nathan Smith. And today we're talking about the church and cultural news, which is always a fascinating thing.
It is.
Nathan, I'm just going to throw this out to you. I don't know if you've heard this stat or not, but reports are showing that the Bible increased in sales by 22% this past year over previous year's sales. So we're seeing this tick up of Bible sales.
I was not aware of that.
Were you not aware of that?
No.
It's pretty fascinating. So everybody's speculating, okay, why is the Bible selling more now? So just off the top of your head, why do you think that is? Why do you think more people are purchasing Bibles?
I honestly have no clue. I mean, I find that encouraging, but I'm really curious to see what is driving that.
Yeah. I think some of the speculation, it's multifaceted. One is that there seems to be somewhat of an eroding of the autonomous self because people have chased down this, it's all about me, it's all about all, and they're realizing, wait a second, it gets to an end. Mm-hmm. And so they're looking for something more historic, something that's bigger than them.
Yeah.
And so you have that. That's one thing that's happening. And on the other side of that is you have a rise in Christian and Christian adjacent kind of media. Mm-hmm. So you have, of course, the things that we desiring God and things that have been out there for a long time, 9 Marks, that kind of stuff. They've been doing things. But then you have kind of these adjacent ones like The Chosen, like the Hallow app, which is a huge thing that's out there. Mm-hmm. Jordan Peterson and his conversations about the Gospels and things like that, Daily Wire, Ben Shapiro and all those guys, they are very much talking up the Bible as a means of authority and a means of stabilization in a culture.
Yeah.
And so I think you have kind of two things happening as the people are hitting the end of that autonomous self and they're realizing it's not what they were promised. Mm-hmm. And then you have all these people talking about the Bible as a positive thing.
Yeah, seeing the cultural move to a point where we've gotten beyond this self as an end in and of itself. People are looking for something more transcendent.
Yeah.
And in a way, our culture is turning more spiritual. And I don't mean Christian or godly, but I mean spiritual and looking for the transcendent, looking for a greater reality, even beyond the modernity of evolution, science. They're looking for something that is mystical intangibility.
Yeah.
And is that playing into it? Maybe. There might be another aspect, and just anecdotally, it seems like Christian publishers are also putting out new editions of the Bible all the time. This study Bible, that study Bible. Anecdotally, I have bought a couple of Bibles in the last couple of years where the previous 10 I have not.
Well, it's about time you're reading it.
Well, wow. Well, okay, so all the 22% is due to me, I confess. But you buy a biblical theology Bible.
I'm sure that plays into
archaeological study Bible because of the proliferation of Christian resources. Could that be playing into it?
Probably.
Maybe.
I'm sure it's multifaceted to some extent.
But it is fascinating.
Yeah.
I do think that there is an increasing hunger in the divine.
Yes.
And probably in all categories, not just, I would like to see our other sales stagnant or also increasing. That might play into more of the narrative of just a greater increase in spiritual hunger.
I think it kind of tracks with what we're seeing, how, especially with young men, young men are moving into, they're looking for something bigger, something more important than themselves. And so they're seeking, and what you're seeing is that you're seeing this move of young men specifically, but in general, young people moving into the Orthodox Church and into Catholicism. And I think we've briefly touched on that before.
Yeah.
Because there is a sense of the transcendent.
And a sense of identity. They know who they are.
Yes.
The Orthodox Church, Roman Catholic Church is a very distinct tradition and understanding.
And it's historical in nature, so it's not just a fad. It's something that's been around for a long time. And so it's connected to something that's historical as well.
Yeah.
So where does the Church of Christ, how do we engage a culture that may be seeking these kinds of things?
Well, I think that we must recognize and embrace the inherent transcendence of Christianity, the fact that this is more than just so you can have a good marriage or to have a healthy, wealthy life. And those are very earthly realities, and there's questions that derive from those that Christianity speaks to.
Yeah.
But Christianity is a transcendent understanding of a divine being, God, who is vastly mysterious and yet at the same time immanent.
Yeah.
And that type of scope of spirituality, but also truth that the scriptures speak to, both in terms of mystery and the concrete nature of our universe, is something that should be embraced and recaptured.
Yeah.
I'll put it in another term, the epic nature of Christianity.
I love that. Yeah.
You know, to really recapture that sense of grandness, that grandiosity of our God, of the creation that He has made, the destiny of the redeemed.
Yeah.
That epic nature of Christianity sometimes has gotten lost in the cheap marketing tricks of maybe what was the progressive, seeker-sensitive, emergent church, or the staleness of the legalistic church. But to recapture that historicity, that epic nature, the grand narrative, and the grand destiny that Christ has brought us into.
Yeah.
I think recapturing that does also speak to the heart of our age.
Yeah. Talking and teaching about a very big God.
Yeah.
And his just the profound, I love it. You talked about even just this past Sunday, the connection of transcendence and immanence and the importance of us capturing both of those in Christ and in the Word. So it's such an important piece of that. So, well, with all that, today we're going to be looking at a couple guys who've been making the headlines. Both of them from Canada, which is always.
Are these going to be like, get my blood pressure going?
No. One of them might. We've kind of had discussions a little bit about Jordan Peterson. He's one of the guys. And so I want to touch base on Jordan because he's a fascinating character. He's one of these guys that, like, you want to like him, but then at the same time you're frustrated with him.
Yeah.
And so he's got a gospel series that's been out there. It's produced by Daily Wire. So
I've watched several of them, actually.
Have you?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. So I have a clip we're going to play here in just a moment. But if you're not familiar with Jordan Peterson, he's a Canadian psychologist, psychologist and author, media commentator. He's on the Daily Wire. He began kind of into fame when he stood up against the Canadian authorities who were trying to make him use other people's pronouns. Yeah. And he saw that as coercive speech, and he didn't like that, and so they were like stripping him of everything they could, and he kind of made himself known through that, and has since kind of made a name for himself in almost it goes back to these young men, empowering young men to take control of their life, to start with making your bed and then leading to guiding your life and basic principles and all those kind of things. Yeah. But he also has an interesting take on the scriptures. And when I've listened to him talk about the scriptures, it has driven me up a wall. So what was your first interaction as you're listening to him talk about the Bible?
Well, Jordan Peterson is a cultural commentarian. Yeah. He comments on culture, he comments on reality, and in terms of politics, society, and he's got some really insightful things, and he's not afraid to think logically. Yes. And he brings that logical analysis into the scriptures, and that is interesting. But what I also see in Jordan Peterson is, frankly, it reminds me of German liberalism from about 150 to 200 years ago. And I know that I wasn't alive back then. Yeah. Neither were you. But basically, Bultmann and a bunch of other of these German theologians during the rise of liberal academia were really trying to push to what is the Jesus behind the Jesus? What is the type behind the type? Yeah. What are the metaphysical themes that are being teased out in Scripture? And they're looking for basically some of the things we can learn off of the person of Christ, but in, again, a very almost romantic, thematic way. Yeah. Now, that can be helpful to a point, but basically what Jordan Peterson does is he talks around Jesus so much and talks around the scriptures, trying to evaluate the psychology of the scriptures, that he misses out on the clear and blatant point truths about who Christ is and what he's actually saying. Yeah. And then it ends up being boiled down into a very works-based righteousness. Yeah. So there's some real challenges there.
It really is interesting to get a taste of it. There was actually a clip that went viral because in it, Peterson talks about Jesus as God. And so I've got this clip, and we'll play it, and then I'd love to get your comments on it as well. So let me see if I can get this going.
You believe that Jesus was God? God.
Yeah. I think if you understand what that means, that it's indisputable. I'll give you.
So is Jesus God? Yes. And everyone's like, yeah, that's awesome. But then he goes into talking about what that means. And this is where it kind of gets...
And there's nothing new under the sun. As people listen to this clip, and I don't know what it's going to say, but I've listened enough to Jordan Peterson. He also sounds like a Gnostic. In other words, Jesus is an expression of the divine rather than divinity itself. And he tends to kind of push that direction. We'll see.
I'll give you a brief explanation of why. Christ takes the sins of the world onto himself. So that means all the problems that there are his problems. The idea there is that there's no difference between making that assumption and then actually beginning to address those problems. And there's no difference between that which best addresses the problems of mankind and the divine. Those are the same thing. And I can't see how that can be otherwise, because the contrary hypothesis would be that you would adapt best to your life by avoiding things that are difficult and terrifying. And no one believes that.
So that's how he sums up godness, is almost the pursuit of the difficult for the sake of something greater. And so in that, he can say Jesus is God because Jesus, in his sacrificial death, going to the cross, represented that godness of enduring the hard thing for the better.
Yeah.
And so it is a very interesting, and I use that word because I really am not sure what else to say.
I think it's helpful for us to analyze even Jordan Peterson himself, that sometimes his reasoning and eloquence and vocabulary is intimidating. And if we're honest, he gets done talking and we say, and what did he just say? Yeah. What did he try and mean by that comment? And he is an extremely intelligent man. But intelligence also must be able to communicate. And what I feel like he's doing constantly is using the English language to dance around issues rather than actually establish, yes, clearly this is what, and this is how it means, and this is the implication thereof. It's a philosophical wrangling with the scriptures and its implications. And he goes too quickly to what it means for us without fully recognizing what Christ in himself is and has done. Yeah. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. And that's actually going to get to here in a minute. We're going to play a clip from Wes Huff, who talked on Joe Rogan about Peterson, and he hits it, I think, the nail on the head with it. But what I find interesting about Peterson is that his hermeneutic is like purely psychological. So he filters all of Scripture through that psychological hermeneutic, and so it's why you never really get to the real Jesus, is because it's all speculative hypothesis. Yeah. And it ends up being very infuriating.
What do you really think, Mike?
Yeah, that's what I really think. So with that said, now let's go to somebody who is very clear. And it's another Canadian guy who made waves a couple weeks ago. His name is Wes Huff, Wesley Huff. He is director of Apologetics Canada, a ministry there. He's an expert in ancient manuscripts, online personality. He does debates and things of that nature. And he was on Joe Rogan, which is the #1 podcast in the world, talking about the Bible, these ancient manuscripts, and even the resurrection of Jesus. And really, he is a guy who I was not that much aware of. I had heard of him here and there. But after watching lots of his stuff, I am just impressed because he speaks with confidence and biblical accuracy
and clarity. Because you sent me one of his clips, and I watched it, and I was very impressed. Yeah, there's a lot of clarity. Now, there's a lot of things we don't know about him yet. Yeah, but thus far, very positive.
Yeah, and so what's fascinating to me, and I think this gets me to kind of how we started this whole conversation, this shift that seems to be happening. There's an openness that seems to be towards the Bible, the scriptures, that we haven't seen before. Rogan himself, as kind of a conduit for cultural change, was very resistant to the gospel, was resistant to the Bible, because he saw it as an affront to, hedonistic living and freedom of expression and all of that. Now there's a shift, and he is welcoming these conversations because he's seeking truth.
I do think, Mike, when talking about the whole question of where the culture is at, I do think one of the positives of our YouTube culture is that there are a lot more Christian voices that are readily accessible to the world or just to a wider audience. Men and women who are academically sound, intelligent, logical, clear, eloquent, and it does away kind of with the boogeyman in the corner caricature of the Christian who is ignorant, a bigot, doesn't care, who's dumb, who doesn't know their stuff. And right now, I mean, you can go online and go to YouTube and see, I'm trying to remember his name, but he's an Oxford scholar who actually is a mathematician, but a strong believer, and debating in the Oxford debates for the existence of God.
Yeah.
But he's a mathematician, a fellow at Oxford. I know he's Keith and Kristen Getty's uncle, I believe.
Okay.
But sweet man, I've actually met him one time. But men and women like that, and that the world looks at and says, oh, okay, they're not stupid, they're not a bigot, they're clear. What they say makes sense. I'm curious. So I think it's the other side of our technological accessibility is that making the voices of the wider church and guys like this, Wes Huff, who are like, this isn't, someone doesn't know his stuff.
And I also think COVID played a part in all this because of COVID, it caused people to be super, skeptical of authority, good or bad, and and now people are going, well, wait a minute. I don't know if I believe what they tell me. So I want to search this out for myself. And so you see some of that on all different areas, and I think we're seeing it in the spiritual world as well.
I think so. John Lennox, that's his name. I just remember.
Oh, thank you.
John Lennox. John Lennox is a mathematician. You can Google him. You can see him on YouTube. Mathematician, Oxford scholar, brilliant, strong believer. Sorry.
All right, so I want to play this clip. And again, this is Wes Huff on Joe Rogan's podcast. We cannot endorse Joe Rogan's podcast. I'm going to say that just clear out, okay? But this is just a really awesome thing that this is going out to millions upon millions of people.
This Jewish itinerant guy who's walking around first century Roman-occupied Judea, he's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection. And then his disciples they think it's over. Like, they're like, he's dead. We're done. And then they go from 11, scared men, because Judas commits suicide, scared men in an upper room, to completely overhauling the Roman world in only a couple hundred years because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there.
So just for context's sake, Joe was asking, like, what are the proofs of this resurrection? Like, this happened so many years ago, thousands of years ago, this happened, and how can we believe these things that were written? And so this is Huff giving an answer to that question.
That they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection?
So as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly unusual.
Right. So
understatement.
But it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else.
And that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient conventions and the ways that things were spread around. But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things. So
how do you fact-check someone coming back from the dead?
Well,
how many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people saw the crucifixion?
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15.
And so, again, he points to the scriptures, and he is, again, arguing for the historicity of the resurrection.
That's correct.
So for somebody like Wes Huff, who is in this context, some people were getting on him that there wasn't an explicit gospel presentation, but he was able to continue to point time and time again to the reality of Jesus, the history of Jesus, the trustworthiness of the scriptures, and all those play a role in helping kind of guide people towards the truth.
I actually heard an explicit gospel presentation in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says, what is the core of our faith? That Jesus died and then rose again according to the scriptures.
Yeah.
And what he just mentioned was the death and the resurrection of Christ, and he's defending the resurrection of Christ. There wasn't a gospel invitation to Joe Rogan like, do you believe? But he did present the tenets of the gospel.
Yeah.
And when we look at the reality and objectivity of the resurrection, what he's bringing out is so critical that even during the time of Christ, Josephus, a Jewish historian, acknowledged the fact that Christians were saying Jesus had risen again.
Yeah.
That other, whether it be Pliny or Tacitus, had written about the Christians who were proclaiming and singing even to their deaths that this Jesus is alive. So from the very beginning of the first and second into the third century, you have the church witnesses, secular witnesses who are writing against the church saying this is what they believe. And so even the movement itself is predicated on the understanding that they're worshiping someone who they believe to not be dead.
Yeah.
So even though he says we're talking about an oral tradition, that's actually, yes, it is oral, but this is also during an age of great writing when we have lots of records of history of what the Romans wrote, about what the Jews wrote, about what the Greeks wrote, about what's going on. We have a lot of information actually to deal with.
Yeah. And that's one thing that Huff continued to go back to. It's like the number of manuscripts, the trustworthiness of the manuscripts is all there. And so the prayer is that, again, millions of people hear these things, and the prayer is that they would hear it and begin seeking out this truth. Now, I will, just in closing real quick, because I did promise it, is Wes Huff on Jordan Peterson. This is his comments about Jordan, which I appreciated, and I figured it'd be a great way to kind of close out our conversation because, well, it works really well. But this is what he had to say about Peterson.
I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. Because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
No.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest.
So that's the key right there.
Yeah.
Is that the flesh and blood person of Jesus, what are you doing with him?
Yes.
And so I think that really gets to that primary point where there's a wrestling with what Peterson is saying compared to the actual truth of the scriptures.
Yes.
Who do you say I am?
Yeah.
Jesus says.
And the refuting of the historical Christ into an idea, into an archetype, is nothing new. Jordan Peterson, what he is an academic liberal. You have to understand him as a theological liberal that is very, very at home with what happened at the turn of the century, the 19th century, and then in the 18th century, German academia that then infiltrated the Yale and the Harvard of the U.S., that really infiltrated that the idea of Christ is more important than the reality of Christ. And if the idea of Christ is more important than the reality of Christ, then what does the virgin birth matter?
Yeah.
What does it matter if it's a literal crucifixion or a bodily resurrection? It's the idea of Christ. It's the loving your neighbor. It is the valuing of human beings. It's the caring for the poor. And if you listen to Jordan Peterson, those are the things he cares about.
Yeah.
He's taking the idea of what Christ stood for and making that Jesus instead of a literal physical person who died on the cross. And so what I also want to point out is that Jordan Peterson is making the headlines, but his ideas are nothing new. Like this is just regurgitated theological liberalism, but from a different perspective.
Yeah.
So to be aware.
And I think that's the key, right? Be aware. This is where we have to, as followers of Christ, we must be discerning in what we are consuming. and that we are always, always, always testing the spirits. We're making sure that they are in line with the Scriptures. If they are not, then we toss them to the side. We understand what they are. And while there may be some principles and things that you can glean from some of Peterson's stuff that may be good for the working of the government or cultural norms or things of that nature, they are not salvific.
That is right.
They're not going to lead you to salvation in Christ.
That is right.
Well, Nathan, thank you. This has been a fun discussion, and I pray it's been a blessing to those who have been listening. Next week, we're going to take a look at the story of Jesus clearing the temple. How should we understand righteous anger versus sinful anger? And is it okay for us to be angry and knock over stuff? Maybe I'll throw this table over, Nathan.
Well, I mean, Mike did yell at me last time we were here, so
it's about time you get over that, okay? Forgive and forget. That's how this works. All right.
Eye for eye, tooth for tooth.
Until then, please take a moment, like, subscribe, and visit us online at focusedonchrist.com.